pull a transcript. Great,
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah. So thanks for giving me this opportunity. I thought what I would do is share briefly how the course was set up, the assignments, and you'll see why later I want to tell you what the students were asked to do, because I'd like to then talk about how I used those assignments and then the feedback that I got from the students on that work. So if that sounds okay to everyone, I want to just real quickly recap what the assignments were, how I used the time, and then I want to share feedback, both explicit feedback from the students, but also things that I inferred or that were implicit from their reactions, not necessarily what they said explicitly. So I should say to start with that from the very beginning, even before this became an online course, the students had to read 2 basic foundational books by Rudolf Steiner, and they had to submit 5 to 10 substantive questions for each text. So that was already an assignment that they had prior to this session. They were also asked to choose a topic of their choice, grades 4 through 8, and collect, without much guidance from me, but collect an assortment of classroom resources on that topic. And the suggestions that they were given were things like poems, songs, movement activities, related language arts or math goals, but just to bring in kind of an assortment of materials to work with. They did not need to provide me with any record of that ahead of time. So that was their preparation ahead of time. My preparation ahead of time ended up being, there were 5 days that I was teaching. Each day I had 4 hours with the students, and I ended up preparing 5 PowerPoint presentations. I uploaded these into Sakai, one for each day, and those PowerPoint presentations were available ahead of time so that students could, even in the days prior to the session, they could go in and begin looking at those. That will become significant later as I talk about their response. What the students could not see ahead of time is that for each day there was a discussion question in forums, and there was also an assignment for them to work on in relationship to all the teaching materials that they had collected in advance. So that was the students' work ahead of time. So it's important just to note that I had a couple of sort of guiding questions for myself as I developed my part of the week. And that was, one is, what would a healthy rhythm look like from the student's perspective, given what Karina was doing with them as well? And closely related to that, in terms of a healthy rhythm, was what were all the different ways that I could engage them, not just having them listen to me talk. And then I should also say, one of my concerns going in was, how could I make sure that the students felt seen and heard over a distance? That was a real concern for me, because I know that, eye contact and response in the setting are really important to me in making students feel seen and heard and valued. So those were sort of operating questions for me and concerns that I took in. So I will say that of the 4 hours, I had 2 hours following Karina in the morning just before lunch. I also had the 2 hours at the end of the afternoon from 3 to 5. So if you can imagine, I'm following on Karina each time. They haven't had a break just before, or they've had a very short break just before they see me. So I had that in mind. I started by asking every day for them to preview the PowerPoint the night before. So this, I felt like, ended up being really important, that when I did my PowerPoint presentation, they weren't actually getting it for the first time, but they had already read it and taken it into their sleep life. And they were really hearing me comment on something that they had already begun to digest. So every morning I started out, I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about these opening remarks, but I had some opening remarks for about the first 15 minutes, but then I went into about a 40-minute or so presentation in my first session every day, with the PowerPoint as my primary visual aid. And sometimes the students interrupted with questions, but for the most part, it was about 40 minutes of my presenting. And at that point, all of us needed a 5 to 10 minute break away from our screens. So we'd get up and move around. When we came back, the next 40 minutes, I usually divided up roughly in half, 15 minutes, 20 minutes times 2. We would then do some combination of large group and small group discussion. And then I would finish out, and I want to talk a little bit about how I finished out. I tried something the first day that went very, very well and chose to continue it the next day. And it fits into this question of how to make the students feel seen and heard over a distance. I had spent a lot of time, with those substantive questions that the students sent in ahead of time. And I had really looked across all the students for themes and connections between their questions. And so I carved out time every day to really dig into those questions and speak to them, especially to questions that multiple students shared or questions that were variations of one another. And what was really evident from the very first day is whenever I quoted them, whenever they heard their own words reflected back, it was almost like I would see them light up across the space between us, right? When they knew that their own words had been read and understood and were being responded to, that was almost when I saw them light up the most. I'll talk about that another way that I use that in a few minutes. So I ended every morning session with about 10 minutes focusing on the questions that they had submitted in advance. And again, not giving names, but directly quoting their words. Again, I quickly saw how effective it was when they heard their own words spoken, and I would end up repeating that every other day. I did something very different in the afternoon. When they came back to me in the afternoon, they were on their 4th session of the day. So I had that in mind, their 4th 2-hour session with us. So after a brief check-in, about 15 minutes, the next thing I did is I set up a question for them to ponder, and I asked them to leave their Zoom connected, but turn off their audio and their video camera, and to head out into a natural spot with a journal and spend the next 25 minutes journaling. They knew that there would be a time later to share from that journal, but they were not turning that journal into me. It was a private document, even though they would get a chance to use that information later. So I sent them out with their Zoom still connected to me, and I was working at my desk. And the reason I just want to mention that is I found that students had questions or were confused. And when I stayed on Zoom, they knew they could pop in at any moment and I would be right there. And students did. They would be gone for 10 minutes and they would come back and say, wait, I didn't understand. And they would ask for clarification. And then they would go back to their tasks. So it was really valuable for me to be right there in Zoom for them to be able to touch back with me. Now, what I had them do was they then had a certain amount of freedom about when they checked back in, because when they checked back in the next time, they were letting me know that they were transitioning to Sakai. So they checked in at their freedom around the 25-minute mark. Some would pop in at the same time. They would straggle in. That was not a problem. I was right there. As they checked in, they would let me know that they were transitioning from their journaling to Sakai, and I would give them then about a half an hour to work with the discussion question and the assignment without the expectation that they would finish those, but I wanted them to have a chance to look over both of those carefully and get started so that if there were any questions, they would have an opportunity to ask all of those questions before we finished for the day. That was particularly important because I was 3 hours ahead of them, and if any of them were working in the evening, they could easily have questions that I couldn't answer late at night. So I wanted to make sure that they saw all of those. So they spent the next half hour in Sakai and then came back to me really with 45 minutes left to go in the day. And I would have thought
Allison,
through.
Can I just pause you there for a
yeah,
second?
Sure.
Just clarify that last piece.
Yes.
If I understand what your sequence there. So thank you so much. This is so just, this is so great to hear, just your process. It sounds like, so they did a natural world journaling task, and then they came back and they had a period of time where they were in the Sakai discussion forum, and there was a prompt that you had given them, and they were writing in the Sakai discussion forum, and they were all doing that at the same time, but not necessarily responding to one another. It was more posting their posts, making their posts.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I had that sequence.
And I'll talk a little bit later, Tom, about how I used this. Now, I think I would have done it very differently if I were teaching over a week, right? I would have had them responding to one another and doing all kinds of things, but knowing that Karina was also assigning homework, I was really cognizant of thinking about the little time that I could ask of them in the day outside the work we were doing in class. Right? They had 8 hours with us, plus both of us were giving them homework, and all of it needed to be completed in 5 days. So it was really an untenable task. But that was my thinking about how to make it as healthy as possible. We spent the last 40 minutes, so the first 30, 35 minutes of that, again, was in some combination of group discussion or small group discussion or large group discussion that I varied up a little bit by day to day, and really responding to what was emerging. So that last 30, 35, 40 minutes was pretty organic on my part as I was listening to what was arising from the group. And I was pretty much using that to respond into the moment to what seemed to be on everybody's mind. But then I would finish the day again by going back to the questions that they had submitted ahead of time. So every day there was 2 little short periods, no more than 10 minutes, where they heard me responding to sometimes really philosophical and complex questions about the pedagogy and the underlying philosophy. I didn't try to speak for any length of time, but little snippets here, little snippets there, especially focusing on places where their questions overlapped. So that represents roughly my pattern per day. I want to just add that after the first day, the way I started each day, and Tom, this is going to come back to this question about how I was using the discussion forum. Every morning, I'm 3 hours ahead of time, so every morning I would wake up and read very carefully all their forum contributions, and I would then prepare something that really showed how their responses fit together. So I would spend some time really elaborating on and connecting and digesting for a group all the different contributions that they had made. And so my opening 10 to 15 minutes every morning was a reflection back to them of the collective wisdom that they had brought to the question. And again, this was another place where I would literally see them light up. This seemed to be really key to making them feel heard and seen, was seeing the ways in which their own words were intertwined together and reflected back across this distance. And again, I don't think I realized that until the first day when I saw their responses, but as soon as I could see those facial responses, I knew that I had discovered something, and I then made that a key part of every subsequent day, was to reflect back what I had heard from them and show also how their different insights complemented one another. So that gives you a picture then of how I use the schedule. I'd like then to just finish out with sharing what their explicit comments were, but also what I inferred from their behavior, some of which I've already shared with you. So what the students said very explicitly was they really liked the fact that they could read the PowerPoints and look at the PowerPoints ahead of time, and that they weren't getting them for the first time when I was giving my presentation. So letting everyone sleep on it and come back to it. And the fact that they were uploaded in Sakai so that they could even go back that night when they had homework. A couple of times in the forum discussions, it was clear to me that they had gone back to my PowerPoint before completing their homework and had collected information and were referring back to slides in the PowerPoint. So they were really using that to their best advantage. So they really loved the fact that that was posted and available. They specifically, another topic, they specifically expressed a preference for small group discussion on balance over large group discussion, even though that it was only a group of 9, which kind of surprised me. I would have thought that 9 was small enough for us to stay in the big group more. But it was very clear that more people participated, and each one of them contributed more, and more was discussed when I divided them into 3 groups of 3. It was just immediately apparent. So I spent at least half of our discussion time I spent in small groups rather than large groups. So those were explicit requests from the students. I will say, and I've already shared this to some extent, what I saw from them was that a 40-minute PowerPoint, though they said they loved the PowerPoints and they really got a lot out of my presentations, the 40 minutes was really pushing the limit of what was digestible. And if I had to go back, I think I would have maybe even divided those PowerPoints in 2 and maybe have divided that presented in 2 parts of the day, because I was really pushing the limit. The students really seemed to do better in the afternoon without just a repeat of the morning, getting out and doing journaling. They really expressed, and it was clear that they benefited from having an invitation to do something different than looking at their screen. But I will add that having it be part of their assignment for me meant that they could claim that time from their families. Remember, many of these are parents who have family members making demands of them on the side. And if I could say, no, this 30 minutes is your journaling time and it's what you're doing for me. It's part of your assignment. It was clear that this gave them permission to claim that time for themselves, maybe in a different way than if it were just a suggestion on my part of something for them to do on their free time. I don't think that they would have followed through, and they wouldn't have been able to really justify claiming that time for themselves. And I've already mentioned the time when I most saw them light up is when they heard their own words reflected back across the space and then interwoven with one another and responded to. That was so evident from day one. Each student had, at the end of the last 2 days of the course, each student had approximately 12 to 15 minutes to present a lesson plan of their own that they had developed over multiple evenings of assignments. So every day I had a theme that was related to lesson planning and lesson development, and every night they had a little bit of homework to do with the same content that they brought with them. So they worked on rhythm the first night. The second night they worked at how to use sleep. How are they going to divide material over multiple days to really use this night time as effectively as possible. And the third day they worked at integrating language arts and math content integrally into their topic content. So they had those 3 different stages of work with their materials. And in the last 2 days, everyone had 10 to 12 minutes. And they exceeded my expectations in creating PowerPoint slides and Google Sheets documents with photographs and lesson plans and music and all kinds of amazing things. So each one of them is leaving with not just their own lesson plan, but 8 other lesson plan block plans with supporting documents all together at the end of the course as kind of a gift to their future selves. So I'm going to stop recording, and I'm also going to stop talking here and just see if there's any questions.